People call the Battle Pike the luck facility, but after over 100 hours here, I actually disagree. So whether you're Pike curious, chasing the gold symbol, or thinking about a world record attempt, I'll show you 7 steps that let you crush the Battle Pike, will make bad paths impossible, break Lucy's AI, decode hint odds, and give concrete teams. I'll also outline a lot of undocumented facts about the Pike, and then at the end, I'll explain the notorious Pike Glitch, which is only doable here in Emerald. But first, what is the Pike, and why does it feel so unfair? Other facilities force the players to do 7 battles in a row per set. The Pike instead forces you to do 7 pairs of rooms per set, although the game does count this as 14 rooms. Each room pair gives the player a choice of 3 paths, which feature supposedly random results. You get a vague hint about one of these paths. Each path then has an event tied to it. There are 9 events in total, varying from single battles to double battles to wild Pokemon rooms and more. The catch is, unless you trigger a healing event, your team won't be healed throughout the challenge. This is why the Pike is famous and also why it can feel unfair. But there's actually a lot we can do to fight back. So let's start with step 1. Anyone who has ever played the Pike will say the same thing. The worst room by far is the status room. When you enter this room, you will be ambushed by either a Dusclops or a Curlier. At this point, it will attack you outside of battle and inflict status on your team. This can be any status. Note that Dusclops is far worse as it's the one that can freeze your team, and freeze is the worst status condition. I'm displaying the odds to get each status condition on screen now. In other videos, I often defend Game Freak's design, but I'm not going to here. This is absolutely not fair at all. I am sure I do not need to explain why, if random members of your team get frozen or put to sleep in particular, and then the next room is a battle of any kind, you're very likely to just lose. The entire internet, including Bulbapedia, is also wrong about exactly how the status room works. There's an NPC in the bottom left which will give you the current rune number of this set. It's her count that decides how many Pokemon will attempt to be statused. If the count is 1 or 3, then the status room Pokemon will only try to status one of your Pokemon. If the count is 5, 7 or 9, it will be 2 Pokemon, and if the count is 11 or 13, it will be all 3 Pokemon. Most good Pike strategies do everything they can to counter this status room specifically. So let's go over the 6 main ideas here. First up, some Pokemon are immune to certain statuses. For example, if you have a ground type Pokemon and the game tries to Thunder Wave it, it won't be paralysed. The same applies to abilities like immunity versus poison. I've listed all the exceptions on screen now. This is helpful but honestly kind of limited. After all, no Pokemon is immune to all status conditions, and so long as you can either be frozen or put to sleep, you can definitely be vulnerable. It's not crazy to run the move Sleep Talk and be kind of immune to sleep, but I don't recommend it. Another idea is to just flip the table on the Pike. Instead of being upset about being hit by status, we can instead use Pokemon that want to be under status. This includes a range of Pokemon, but most relevant are the abilities Guts and Marvel Scale. The move Facade also helps offset this. Unfortunately, after trying this a lot, I will warn you that it never works quite as well as people hope it does. Let's say we have a Pokemon like Guts Heracross. Yes, it's great that we get the power boost, but if Heracross is paralysed, it might not be able to use a move at all before being knocked out, and that's not to mention being frozen or being put to sleep. And because the status in the status room is random, we end up wanting to still just avoid this room anyway. What about ways to heal or remove the status? Well, this is actually a much better idea. Lumberry is an incredible item in the Gen 3 frontier, but it's even better in the Pike. You can only use it once in a set of 7 room pairs, but that one time could definitely save you. Also very good is to heal the status with abilities such as Natural Cure, or via moves such as Rest or Refresh. Of these moves, Rest is the better option, and I'm going to explain why later. The good news about Rest is that almost everything learns it, and it's a TM you can get multiple copies of through the ability Pickup. But unfortunately, Rest won't help you cure the freeze status. And that brings us to probably the best true counter, which is team-wide status healing. For Generation 3 specifically, this means Heal Bell and Aromatherapy. Unfortunately, getting these moves on good Pokemon isn't easy. Dragonite, Articuno, Lapras and Altaria are decent options, but must be obtained through Pokemon XD if you want these moves. Almost everything else is honestly not good enough on its own, except for the absolute GOAT, Blissey. Blissey learns both of these moves through breeding, although Aromatherapy is the better option as it is not blocked by enemies with Soundproof. Blissey is amazing in this role, not just because of its bulk, but also because it has the natural cure ability itself. This means even if your entire team is frozen, you can switch to Blissey, switch out, then return to Blissey and use aromatherapy to remove all freeze. This works so long as Blissey doesn't faint in the process, but I'll discuss Blissey more in a team building section. There are 2 more tricks though which can completely avoid the status room, and we'll go over those later in the video. So in the Pike, your team needs to be very good in both single battles as well as double battles, and it's harder than you think to design a team that works well in both. First up, play level 50. The Frontier is easy at level 50, particularly in doubles. If you must play open level, at least play at level 65 or above. Pike doubles opponents will only have 2 Pokemon, unlike single battles where they will have 3. This is helpful because it means that safe target redirection works like it does in future generations. You don't have to worry about a mid-turn switch in. Now a lot of very good double battle moves don't work as well in singles, particularly Fake Out and to a lesser extent Protect. By far the strongest strategy in Generation 3 doubles is to abuse the ridiculous power of Doubles Explosion. But we should be avoiding strategies that intentionally kill our party members in a facility that doesn't automatically heal us. So instead I recommend a very simple but very effective primary game plan centered around Choice Band Earthquake with various offensive backup options. Choice Band Earthquake from a strong enough attacker will regularly knock out at least 1 enemy in doubles. That enables your floating ally to pick up an assist kill on the one that may survive. Of course, this does make enemy floaters a problem too, so the non-Earthquake Pokemon should probably carry moves like Ice Beam or Thunderbolt. If you are not confident in your ability to guess whether or not an enemy is going to faint to an attack, you should really be using a damage calculator. The one I've linked has preloaded sets for the entire Generation 3 Frontier. You can also use Bulbapedia or a spreadsheet to look up the enemy trainer. Now speaking of the enemy trainer, how does that work in doubles? Aren't there 2 of them? Well actually no. The game loads in 2 enemy trainers, but whichever one is first will supply both enemy Pokemon slots. The second trainer is just kind of there for moral support, I guess. This isn't irrelevant though, because an enemy trainer can never appear twice in a single set of 7 rune pairs. Another common question that gets asked a lot in the Frontier is if a Pokemon should use a modest or timid nature for special attackers, or an adamant or jolly nature for physical attackers. There is actually an answer to this. If the Pokemon is over 80 base speed, you should go for the speed boosting nature, and even if it's under 80, you should seriously consider the speed boosting nature anyway. Everyone with real experience in the Generation 3 Frontier will agree with this. The enemy sets here are uniquely slow, and while doing 10% less damage sometimes might sound bad, I will tell you for a fact that being unable to use a move because the enemy moves first is much worse. Everyone seems to massively overvalue this 10% damage increase and forget that the random damage range in every attack calculation is already 15%. So ideally your team in the Pike should have a Choice Band Pokemon with Earthquake, and some kind of floating ally with special attacks. You should also have a few other extremely powerful options to shut out the game before you start getting hit. You do also get a third Pokemon of course, and it's useful if this third Pokemon is good in doubles, but it definitely doesn't have to be. We'll talk about that more later. Another important aspect of doubles is you want to be aware of some of the basics of how the smart AI operates. The AI really likes to target down low HP Pokemon. Or to be more specific, if we have 2 Pokemon on the field and one of them is very low on HP, we can be pretty sure that both enemies are about to attack that Pokemon. But what to do with this information isn't always that obvious. You could switch out to the third Pokemon, you could try and end the battle on turn 1 and KO both enemies. You could also decide that this Pokemon fainting is okay. What I will tell you is that this scenario is incredibly common, and it's a reason to seriously consider the move Protect, as it can essentially buy you a turn for free, although obviously it's harder to run Protect on a Choice Band Pokemon. Another big consideration is the item Quick Claw, even on a fast Pokemon. Quick Claw forces a Pokemon to go first in its priority bracket. You might think why bother, but in Generation 3, Quick Claw has a global check per turn. That means that if an enemy Quick Claw ever activates, yours will also activate, which forces a Quick Claw speed tie. This effectively means you have a 10% chance of getting screwed by enemy Quick Claw users instead of a 20% chance. Quick Claw can also be useful if your lead Pokemon gets paralysed. Obviously Quick Claw can be useful in singles too, but it's a lot stronger in doubles, because you're using it to potentially outspeed both opponents. Quick Claw isn't an amazing option. There are only 4 other items you'd really consider in the Battle Pike. But let's move on to the next step. Another famous room is the Wild Pokemon room. This is a massive source of optimization for Pike runs, even if a lot of casual players don't actually struggle here. What's strange about this room is you can just run from the wild Pokemon here. For the first 20 sets or 280 rooms, and that's more than double what you need for gold, this will work fine. You do need a Pokemon that outspeeds Wild Milotic, or more than 112 speed at level 50, but anything you can think of as fast can definitely do this. Even if you get paralysed, the paralysis speed drop isn't included in the run speed calculation, but there is a bit of a problem. Maybe your lead Pokemon is fast, but if it faints then you're forced to send out your second Pokemon instead, and if they are slower than Wild Milotic, suddenly you may fail to escape and take damage here. Remember that you cannot change the order of your Pokemon during a Pike run. Now I mentioned the first 280 rooms for a reason. The way that the wild Pokemon work in the Pike is that Seviper and Milotic will always show up, and the third Pokemon will change depending on your streak length. At first the third Pokemon is a very slow Dusclops, which you can obviously just run from. But after the first 280 rooms, things start to get worse. Electrode appears next, and Electrode is obviously much faster than Milotic. Your lead Pokemon will need to hit 159 speed to be completely safe now. If you aren't fast in this Electrode, then you risk the Generation 3 explosion, which you must remember is effectively 500 base power. These wild Pokemon do have random AI, but that's one hell of a risk to take. At 560 rooms, Breloom starts appearing, but Breloom is much easier to deal with. Just be careful of Effect Spore. The real kicker is after 840 rooms. Game Freak make a nasty decision here and actually send in Wobbuffet. You obviously cannot escape this due to Shadow Tag, and attacking it is obviously very risky. On a side note, I'm surprised that Game Freak bothered to add code for streaks this long. After 840 rooms, we're approximately 6 times further away than the gold print, and less than 5 people I know of have ever got this far legitimately. I do have a few tips for the wild Pokemon room. First up, some abilities are very useful again. Intimidate and Keen Eye both half the chance of the game generating a wild Pokemon which is not Seviper or Milotic. Unfortunately, wild Seviper and Milotic are level 46 and therefore not affected. So Intimidate basically reduces the wild encounters by around 24%. Runaway would also be extremely helpful, except that almost no good Pokemon learn this ability. Now the best tool here, especially against Wobbuffet, is actually the item Smoke Ball. This can be used multiple times in a run and guarantees escape even if your Pokemon is slow or facing a Pokemon like Wobbuffet with Shadow Tag. The problem is that the Smoke Ball is useless outside of the wild Pokemon room. Another anti-Wobbuffet move is actually Roar or Whirlwind, which effectively work a bit like running from a battle, and they're not totally useless in single battles. Another thing you might be thinking is, what if we just attack and knock out the enemy Pokemon? This is actually a very good idea against Seviper specifically for a reason I'm going to bring up later, but be careful doing this against Milotic, which can easily be bulky enough to survive moves like Thunderbolt. One last thing, for Wobbuffet specifically, boosting moves are also a good idea. Swords Dance and Calm Mind are both high PP options, and you should find that +4 is going to be enough to OHKO a wild Wobbuffet. You can also beat Wobbuffet quite safely if your Pokemon is immune to the respective counter coat move. So for example, a Dark type Pokemon using Crunch in Generation 3 can't be hit by Mirror Coat, but you do always need to pay attention to Destiny Bond. We've talked about 3 bad outcomes so far, but let's focus on a good one. This one is really important for maximising our odds of keeping the streak alive. There's one which will heal your entire party, and there's another which will randomly heal either 1 or 2 Pokemon. Obviously being healed is good, but what is arguably better is a healing room still counts as a room. If you get a healing room, that's 1 less room that could have killed your run. Here's what you need to know about healing. Any damage at all to a Pokemon marks that Pokemon as capable of being healed. That includes even using just a single PP on a single move. This is really important. Let's say we're in the Pike and we have a very healthy lead Latios and we also have a very damaged Blaziken in the back. If I want to maximise the chance of Blaziken being healed, I should avoid using a single PP with Latios unless I have no choice. Even against wild Pokemon, I want to do nothing. If I can do this, then when I enter a room that might randomly heal only 1 party member, it will guaranteed heal Blaziken and not waste the heal on Latios. If I had used a single PP on Latios, then this healing room could heal Latios instead of Blaziken, which would have almost wasted the heal entirely. Of course, maybe I don't get the chance to do that. If I have to use Latios, then I have to use Latios. But there's an even more important aspect to healing. You see, these healing rooms can never appear before any of your Pokemon take damage. This means that the first room in a Pike set will never be a healing room, since you always start with a fully healed team. And this is why it's quite important to KO wild Pokemon. For example, if I have a full health team and Latios can OHKO an enemy Survivor with Psychic, that would mean that Latios now has 1 PP missing, and all the healing runes become active because Latios can now be healed. As you'll see later, this is actually a very big deal in terms of the odds that you get to generate different rooms. But there's actually another way to heal outside of healing rooms. Moves like Recover and Milk Drink can be used inside the battles, particularly against wild Pokemon, to heal up. But moves like Soft Boiled and Milk Drink specifically can be used outside a battle. They will transfer 20% of the total HP from the user to the target. This might sound like an even trade, but if the user is specifically Blissey, it's definitely not. This is borderline cheating. It almost behaves like a free heal. Just don't overdo it and get Blissey too low on HP. But since Blissey can easily heal up on wild Pokemon, you can essentially use wild Pokemon rooms to almost fully heal the HP of your entire team. So suddenly the wild Pokemon room also acts a bit like a healing point. Of course, you cannot recover HP on a fainted Pokemon, so Blissey teams should heavily prioritise keeping Pokemon alive at a sliver of HP over letting them faint if possible. So the real question is, how can we make wild Pokemon rooms and healing rooms appear more often? Something I have ignored up until now is the Pike hint system. This NPC will give a vague hint about one of the paths for each room pair. There's a huge amount of misinformation and nonsense online about how this hint system works, and understanding and mastering the hint system is essential to destroying the Pike. In fact, it's probably the most important tip in this entire video. First up, there are only 5 hint descriptions you can ever see, and the 5th one is just to tell you that Pike Queen Lucy is next, and you can't do anything about this. So really, there are just 4 hints you need to care about. Each one of these hints translates to 2 potential rooms. For example, the Nostalgia hint means it's either going to be a status room or a room where 1 or 2 Pokemon are healed. The other hints follow a similar setup. Generally speaking, one outcome is good for you and one is bad for you. At first, it looks like none of these hints can ever guarantee something good. But the first point here, and what's most important to understand, is that if you get a hint for a path, the path hinted at must be one of those rooms, and every other path must not be one of those rooms. Now, the very basic strategy of optimizing for hints is to simply avoid something you don't want. So let's say we never want to get statused. Well, if we see the Nostalgia hint, we never go down that path. But this also means that if we see any hint that is not Nostalgia, we must go down that path, because taking any other hint could give us a status room. This is the 5th, but not final way of dealing with the status room that I mentioned earlier. And this is also the basics of the Battle Pike. Maybe your team never wants to do double battles. Well, you can simply apply similar logic and never see a double battle room. But that's only pretty basic strategy. We can do a lot more. You might think that the hint system works something like this. First, the game generates a random hint. Then we randomly pick one of the paths and assign that hint to the path. And then, when we go down that path or another path, the game will randomly decide which room fits the hint or which room doesn't fit the hint. From a game design perspective, this would be the obvious thing to do, but the Pike does not actually work like this. Instead, the game picks a path and assigns an exact room to that path. The game then picks a hint that matches that exact room and will generate other paths based randomly on any room that isn't included in the hint. That might sound similar, but it's actually very different, because it means that the game has generated the exact room type that's going to be through one of the doors. And then we get into even more weirdness. You see, if you can't be healed, then the healing rooms basically don't exist in terms of the Pike room generation logic. But status and double battle rooms follow a very different flow. This is the 6th way of dealing with status. The status room cannot be generated if all your Pokemon have a status already, and that includes being fainted. If this happens and the game generates a status room, the game will then change its status room to become the NPC room instead. And for the double battle room, you can't enter a double battle if you don't have 2 Pokemon alive. So if you have only 1 Pokemon left, it will set the double battle room to become the NPC room instead, just like with the status. So under particular conditions, the NPC room can actually become much more likely. Specifically, it means that if all our Pokemon have a status condition, and it's the Whispering hint, then there's actually a 2/3 chance of it being the NPC room instead of the double battle room. It is not actually a 50-50. And it also means that if you have only one Pokemon left, then the Whispering Hint must be the NPC room and can never be the double battle room. That might sound pretty basic, but there are a lot of old internet rumours and guides that seem to imply that certain rooms are more or less likely than others. For example, we know that the Pokemon Hint means it's a 50-50 for either the Wild Battle room or the Battle with Healing After room. Now, if you're a creative problem solver, then your head is probably buzzing with what I'm about to mention next. This is the real depth of the Pike. We can manipulate and abuse how rooms are generated and which rooms are or aren't possible. The simplest version of this is of course making sure it's possible for our team to be healed at all. This changes the people hint from being 100% single battle to just 50% single battle. It also changes nostalgia from 100% status to only 50% status. Related to this is how I mentioned in the double section that in some scenarios we may prefer to have only one Pokemon alive instead of two. While doing this is a risk, it does mean that the Whispering Hint becomes a 100% NPC room, and also random rooms which ignore the hint is 2 out of 5 to become a battle instead of 3 out of 6. But that's not the most powerful thing we can do. Think back to the start where I said that the least bad status condition was poison. This might sound a bit extreme, but in the wild Pokemon room we can stall until we find a wild Milotic. At this point we can intentionally let our team get fully poisoned. That's one final way of dealing with the status room, making it impossible through intentionally getting poisoned in the wild Pokemon room. There is some downside in this. Poison does 1 HP of damage every 4 steps outside the battle, and this is one aspect of the entire Pike where being level 100 is better than being level 50, as we lose relatively less HP. But the fact is, we're super unlikely to actually faint to that poison damage. A fully poisoned team not only makes future status streams impossible, it also guarantees that in a future battle our team cannot be put to sleep by hypnosis, or paralysed, or burned, or frozen, or whatever. Being poisoned is arguably better than having no status in some cases. Of course, a strategy like this should only be combined with Heal Bell or Aromatherapy support so that we can remove the poison in the next battle if we need to. But often this isn't necessary. Most double battles end in a single turn, and single battles are actually quite rare because we're intentionally going to be choosing the nostalgia and whispering hints where possible. But this is also still ignoring further optimization. The real question is, why should our strategy be so static and unchanging? Well, this is what the true Pike strategy endgame looks like. We need to change what we do based on the exact scenario we're in. This isn't just the status of our team, but also the number of rooms we've cleared so far in this set. But for completeness, let me give a brief overview of the 4 hint types and what I recommend you should do. First up is the people hint. You should almost never take this room. The reason for this is that a 3v3 single battle without healing is widely considered to be the most dangerous room by far. You would only ever take this room to gamble on the 50% full heal chance. And for that gamble to be worth it, your team would have to be massively damaged and you'd have to have a lot of rooms left in the set. And the fact is, you're unlikely to be in a situation this bad if you follow the rest of the advice anyway. Next up is the Whispering Hint. If you only have one Pokemon alive, you should always take this room, because it's a guaranteed skip. Apart from that, the question is going to be how ready you are for a double battle. If you are paralysed, asleep, or frozen, you definitely want to avoid this. You may also want to avoid this if you only have 2 Pokemon alive, especially if your lead Pokemon specifically has been knocked out. But if your team is quite healthy, and if you have built your team around double battles, I actually recommend a Whispering Room. Double battles are usually quite easy, so long as you have a fast team, like I recommend. Now the Nostalgia Hint is much harder. First up, you should always take this on the 13th room, since it's the last room of the set anyway. You should also always take this if your Pokemon all have a status condition. You should also never take it if your party is fully healed, as it will be a guaranteed status. Apart from that, it's quite a tough call. Blissey teams don't mind nostalgia as much, and if you already have an okay status condition, like a burn on a special attacker or poison, or if your team still has its Lumberry intact, then perhaps it's a risk worth taking. Now the Pokemon hint is the one you should change the most for. You always want to take this room if your team is healthy. This is because you should expect to win the singles battle, and you will get fully healed after it. And the wild Pokemon room should cause you no trouble if your lead is still alive. But the weaker your team gets, the more you want to avoid the Pokemon room. The risk is obviously doing the singles battle with a damaged team. You can probably win a 2v3, but just remember that your chance of winning is going to be much lower. Of course, this is particularly true if your team is also statused. On the 13th and final room, if your team is damaged, you should probably always avoid this room. Now those are the 4 hints, but we also always want to consider what the other side of the coin is. What are the odds for the rooms that are not hinted at? It may seem great to say I want to avoid the status room, but if you do this then you will have the chance of walking into the single battle room without the healing at the end, and vice versa. It's impossible to always avoid the bad rooms. And the biggest improvement we can have when taking the path that is not being hinted at is to make sure our team is slightly damaged, as the odds of a bad outcome go way down if we can get one of these healing rooms to be possible. It's also really important to keep a mind on the room count. If you are badly damaged but at the 11th room, which means you'll only have 2 rooms left, you might want to gamble on dodging battles entirely, or you might want to gamble on getting a heal room before the final room. It's not easy to say what is actually better here, and it definitely depends on how badly damaged your team is and what your exact team composition looks like. Now this was just a simple overview of the strategy, but I'm sure you can appreciate that in real scenarios it becomes incredibly difficult to know exactly what to do, and very hard to optimize. This is why I think the Pike is a lot more difficult, but also more skillful than people give it credit for. And if you do ignore these hints, you're basically guaranteed to run into some unwinnable scenario. In this section we'll go over Pike Queen Lucy and also team recommendations. Now no 2 Pike runs will ever look the same, but something that is very consistent is Lucy. Lucy is not actually a hard boss. In fact, she's definitely the easiest frontier brain on paper. But you often face Lucy with a very damaged team, and in a state like that you must not underestimate her. Now to get the gold symbol, you obviously have to defeat the gold symbol Lucy fight, and if you want to go further, Lucy also appears every 56 battles after the gold symbol. So this is also very relevant for world record attempts. Now there is a Pokemon that destroys Lucy so badly that it almost embarrasses her, and it's Latios. The way this goes is actually very simple. First up, Latios can OHKO the Viper with Psychic. Like all Pike trainers, Lucy has Smart AI, and will therefore switch into Gyarados, because it has the super effective move Dragon Dance. Yes, Dragon Dance is a status move, but that doesn't matter for the AI. Latios is then able to OHKO Gyarados with Thunderbolt. Lucy will then send in Steelix, and this is the reason why Latios is so good against Lucy. See, Gyarados has the ability Intimidate. It's a fairly advanced Smart AI interaction, but the fact that our Levitator user in Latios was hit by Intimidate means that the Smart AI now thinks that Latios has Intimidate and not Levitate. And this means that Steelix will attempt to attack Latios with Earthquake and not Rock Slide. It will only do this once, but this buys Latios an entire extra turn, which it doesn't really need to win the fight anyway. Because of this Smart AI interaction, a reasonably healthy Latios will easily beat Lucy on its own. Now a few other Thunderbolting Levitate leads can achieve similar results, although be careful with something like Gengar, as without Stab, Seviper can obviously survive Psychic. Gengar being weak to rest will still force in Gyarados just like Latios does. The fact that Latios is so incredibly strong in other single and double battles means that it's an easy include for the lead on our team. Specifically, Lumberry, Timid, Calm Mind Latios is ridiculously good. Not only does it dumpster Lucy, but Calm Mind also easily helps you defeat enemy Wobbuffet. Of course, the other incredibly broken Pokemon is Blissey. Specifically, Aroma Fairy Soft-Boiled Blissey. Blissey is basically cheating, as it can indirectly heal teammates outside of battle while taking on minimal risk. And on top of that, Blissey basically invalidates every special attacker, especially in Generation 3, where a lot of special moves are just a bit weaker. My special tip for Blissey is to run a very fast set. This is not just to make Blissey faster than almost all wild enemies so you can run away from them, but also because the Nightmare scenario, where Blissey has to switch in, switch out again to activate Natural Cure, and then switch in again to use Aromatherapy, puts a huge amount of pressure on Blissey to use Aromatherapy before fainting. The best way to get a move off is to be fast, and because the Generation 3 Frontier is so incredibly slow, Blissey can outspeed a surprising number of enemies with near max speed investment. Now the last Pokemon of course should be the Choice Band Earthquake user. I recommend going Jolly and trying to at least hit the 152 speed benchmark for base 100. The most obvious choices would include Tauros or Salamence, as they can both provide excellent support with Intimidate in both doubles and in singles for Blissey. Remember not to worry too much about super effective coverage on Choice Band Pokemon. The best fourth move fairly often does look a bit silly, but don't worry about that. And also don't worry about running 2 Dragon or 2 Normal type Pokemon in the same team. It matters way less than you think it does. Remember that Blissey easily beats most Ice Beam users, and Latios will easily beat most fighting types, or at least put them in range of being killed by Tauros or Salamence. But what if you only have Emerald and you can't get access to Latios anymore? Well, the budget version of the team that I'm going to suggest is probably Starmie, Slaking and Flygon. This team does trade in a lot of usefulness in double battles, as to let Slaking Earthquake safely you need to switch out or have Starmie already be fainted. Flygon is also pretty desperate for the Lumberry here because it's worried about being burnt. I also recommend the item Shell Bell on the lead. Here Starmie has the ability Natural Cure, and so Shell Bell is much better than Leftovers. The reason for this is that Shell Bell heals as you do damage, and because you'll be OHKOing a lot of wild Pokemon, this means you'll be healing before the end of the turn, which is an important difference in Generation 3, because it means you actually get to heal in the wild battle. Now Slaking is not actually an easy Pokemon to use very well, and you want to be aware of just how much the AI loves to use the move Protect, particularly on the first turn in Generation 3 for smart AI. Flygon is also a surprisingly good Pokemon, but teaching both Slaking and Flygon the TM Earthquake requires a level 91 plus pickup user. That might sound annoying, but speaking of pickup, you'll probably want it regardless. Running out of PP on the Pike is a real problem, particularly on the lead Pokemon. You want to use a lot of PP ups or PP maxes on them, and these can also be farmed through pickup. There are a few other ideas in replacements. Guts, Swellow and Heracross can be disgustingly strong with Choice Band and the Guts boost, although as I warned earlier, this doesn't work quite as well as you think. The same is true for attempting something like Wish Pass support instead of the simple out of battle soft boiled. So Milotic, Gyarados and Zapdos are also viable options, although I don't love any of them. And a lot of players like using Swampert or Metagross. I've never really found the same level of success though, particularly on super long record attempts. The lack of speed is pretty bad here, and Metagross being immune to poison is arguably actually a bad thing. But these Pokemon have gone far in the past and so do deserve a mention. Anyway, it's time for one of the biggest bugs in Emerald. So a question you were probably burning to ask earlier was, what if I had a Pokemon that was poisoned, which fainted on the same tile I stepped into the double battle room when I only had 2 Pokemon not yet fainted? Wouldn't this mean you maybe just entered the double battle room with only 1 Pokemon still alive? This is almost impossibly rare to happen by accident, but it's also pretty easy to set this up with poison. And the answer is, it kind of breaks the game. If you manage to win that double battle, you will be immediately forced to lose your streak, and then something really weird happens. See, Game Freak did not want Smeargle to be able to sketch moves in the Frontier. Once used, the move sketch is supposed to permanently get replaced by whatever the move was that we just copied. So to make sure that sketch didn't work in the Frontier, Game Freak wrote some special code that said, if the Pokemon has different moves coming out of a facility compared to going in, change that move back to sketch, no matter what it was. Okay, let's return to that glitched double battle. The poison Pokemon fainting on the step that we walked in kind of broke our party menu. The game sort of tried to send in our original lead twice. Whatever the Pokemon was that just fainted has been deleted and replaced with a glitched clone copy of whatever we just tried to send out. That's actually kind of fine, but it's very interesting to see what happens to this copy. You see, this Pokemon obviously went in with different moves before it got deleted and cloned, but it's also definitely come out with different moves because you probably didn't have the same exact moves on both leads. So the Smeargle sketch scenario kicks in, and this new Pokemon becomes a clone, and every single one of its moves that are different to what it originally was become the move sketch. There are a few details I missed out, and I'm going to include a link to a more detailed video, but this is known as the Pike Sketch Glitch. You'll have to delete a Pokemon to perform it, but it also lets you do incredibly broken things. Once you have sketch on a Pokemon, you can obviously sketch anything onto that slot. That means you can put illegal moves on, but a lot of players have done this to put legal moves on instead. And this is a somewhat clever way to get around a single-use TM limitation, or to get moves that you can only learn specifically in games like Colosseum or XD Gale of Darkness. In that way, it's kind of almost ethical cheating, although some viewers may of course disagree with that. This is a very cool glitch, but I highly recommend that you research it properly before trying it, as it is quite destructive and it will delete Pokemon. Speaking of bugs, if you enjoyed that, I recommend checking out my Generation 4 Battle Haul video, where I go over one of the most infamous bugs ever found. I'll link that on screen now.